Welcome to the first episode of the Spooky Spooktober Stories series. This month we're going to be talking exclusively about horror books, starting with a book that some people may not consider to be a horror book, so we're off to a great start already. We're going to be talking about The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. So welcome to Good Word Reviews. I hope you're having a great day, or if you're listening to this while trying to fall asleep, I hope this lulls you into a restless slumber. I know what I said. It's October. So without further ado, let's talk about The Picture of Dorian Gray. I'm freezing this here because I forgot to include a disclaimer, but this review will contain spoilers. I don't think that should be too much of an issue. The Picture of Dorian Gray is one of the most famous stories of all time, that even if you haven't read the book, chances are you know how it ends, or at least where the story goes. But with that in mind, just know that this review does contain spoilers of the ending of The Picture of Dorian Gray. I unfortunately am on meds right now for the next 2 weeks. I can't drink during that time. So instead of having my usual beverage, I have a bubbly. So The Picture of Dorian Gray is the first and only novel from the Irish poet and playwright Oscar Wilde. Published in 1890, it was immediately the subject of an extreme amount of controversy, mainly due to its homoerotic undertones. Scratch that. Homoerotic overtones. This is a very, very gay novel. And the British public didn't like that. They considered this novel to be corruptive to young men. The release of this novel brought to the forefront Oscar Wilde's rumored proclivities. He was, at the time, I believe they called it a confirmed bachelor. So much so that in 1895, a nobleman showed up at Oscar Wilde's club and called him a sodomite. For this insult, Wilde, probably against better judgment, sued him for libel. During this trial, evidence was brought to light that confirmed the insult in question, and then led to Oscar Wilde himself being put on trial and subsequently jailed for sodomy and gross indecency. He spent 2 years in jail and then fled to France, and 3 years after his release, in 1900, he died in a hotel in Paris, destitute, disgraced, and depressed. An absolutely just tragic end to somebody who deserved a lot better. So The Picture of Dorian Gray starts at an artist's residence, Basil Hallworth's, as he is painting his latest muse, an impossibly beautiful young man named Dorian Gray, whose beauty has reignited the spark of life in this painter and has allowed him to paint his masterpiece. Also present is a nobleman, Lord Henry Wotton, who is pretty much Oscar Wilde. I love Henry Wotton. He is one of my favorite characters in any book ever. He is so funny. So while taking a break from the painting, Lord Henry and Dorian go for one of those wistful, Victorian, arm-in-arm walks in Basil's garden. And Lord Henry begins to plant the seeds of his philosophy, and by that I mean Oscar Wilde's philosophy, in Dorian's head. And essentially the end result is that Dorian has the revelation, and he realizes for the first time that he is beautiful. And this moves him, so much so that he calls out to the heavens and asks that his age, instead of being reflected on his body, gets cast onto this painting. Of course, his wish is granted, which fuels his very famous descent into extreme narcissism and self-absorption, sadism, decadence, anger, murder over the next 20 years. The book itself has 3 distinct parts to it, in which it kind of adopts 3 very distinct styles that are very different from one another. It starts out as like a twee comedy, a social commentary of the time, a satire. And that first part of this book, the first 10 chapters, are some of my favorite writing ever. It's where you'll get almost all of the famous quotes. Because Oscar Wilde, very famous for his witticisms, his aphorisms, seems to have front-loaded them all in this book and given them to Lord Henry. Quotes like, "Nowadays, people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. When one is in love, one always begins by deceiving oneself, and one always ends by deceiving others." Or it is personalities, not principles, that move the age. It is just one after another, rapid fire, in those first 10 chapters. And I love it. I really do. I absolutely love it. You are flipping just page after page after page. And then like a car impacting a wall going 100 miles an hour, you come to an abrupt stop in chapter 11. Chapter 11 is really interesting. At the end of the previous chapter, Lord Henry bequeaths Dorian with a poisoned book. Not poisoned in the sense that he opens it and then suffers 3d6 poison damage for 1d10 turns, but poisoned in that it poisons his mind. It introduces him to a new way of thinking, a way of thinking that consumes him for 18 years. While this book that has such an indelible effect on Dorian is never named in the text, it is in fact J.K. Huysmans' A rebours against nature. Now you may say that my French pronunciation sucks, but you know who doesn't agree with you? Duolingo. So Huysmans' Against Nature is one of, if not the quintessential decadent or neo-decadent movement's book. It's about an old aristocrat who holes himself up in this villa in the countryside. And in this villa there is just a museum's worth of stuff. Like tapestries, fabrics, pottery, art, etc. And this great collection of things fuels this excitement, this fervor in this guy. Which is essentially what happens to Dorian. Chapter 11 is one long list of stuff. If I remember, it starts with musical instruments that he's collected over 2 decades, and then ends with him in this almost like a fever dream talking about these tapestries that he's collected that depict famous acts of violence, religious or otherwise. And while I totally appreciate Oscar Wilde referencing the stuff that he likes to such an extent, it is jarring to follow up such a strong introduction to a book, those first 10 chapters, with this Huysmans decadent list thing. I'm personally not a fan. Luckily it's only 1 chapter, but it definitely is a misstep, in my opinion. After that second part, it then gets into its third part, which is the Gothic horror section of the book. Very Edgar Allan Poe-like. This third part of the book couldn't be more different than the first. Whereas the first part gives you this really floral, beautiful prose describing this idyllic summer. Wilde, in painstaking detail, will describe the sway of wind through the grass and how everything is quiet, so much so that the buzz of a bee through that grass is oppressive. It's really beautiful writing, and it paints a picture of this rosy, happy, beautiful London. And then you get to part 3, and it is foggy, rainy, dank, Jack the Ripper London. I mean, he really pulls all the stops in setting up that atmosphere, and he sets it up really well. It's an atmosphere I like a lot. It's one that I think we can all picture. It reminds me a lot of that Tom Hardy show, Taboo, which is a bit style over substance, no doubt, but he really nails the style. I mean, part 3 is just oozing in atmosphere, and it goes to some really dark places. And in this conclusion, he gets a visit from his old friend Basil, the man who painted him. Basil comes with some friendly advice. Over the last 18 years that separate part 1 and part 3, Dorian has been hard at work corrupting those around him. Men, women, all meeting disgraceful ends. And this moralizing throws Dorian into a rage, and he kills Basil in the attic after showing him the painting, which now is just this hideous, marred, old, wrinkled, blood. There's blood dripping off his hands that's coming through the canvas. And the rest of the third part is him having this sort of crisis of conscience as he worries if his crimes will be uncovered. But what I find really interesting is that he has this moment of self-reflection where he wonders if this crisis of conscience is an actual crisis of conscience, or is it not just another layer of self-preservation and self-absorption. He questions whether the few good deeds that he had been doing of late are in fact due to him trying to be good, or is it just him trying to escape his fate? I think that psychology is actually pretty nuanced. So the book concludes with Dorian confronting his painting, and in an attempt to lift this curse, or blessing that became a curse, he stabs the painting with the same knife that he used to kill the painter. The result is that it does lift the curse, and all of the sin and age and marring and dregs of his soul are cast into him. And his servants come in and they find his body on the ground, unrecognizable save for a ring, and the painting restored to its former glory, as it had been 20 years prior, showing a young, bright-eyed, optimistic, beautiful Dorian. The Picture of Dorian Gray is a really interesting book because it has some very severe flaws. It stumbles quite a bit. However, it starts on such a high note, and it does have a satisfying conclusion. that overall it still is just one of my favorite books. I wouldn't say it's like one of the best books ever written, but it is for sure one of my favorite books. It is so enjoyable. Those first 10 chapters will have you laughing out loud. I mean, really, when we get into the stickiness of it, like all of those stickies are in the first 10 chapters, with the exception of like 5. So give it a read if you haven't read it. I really think everybody should read this. It is such a part of culture. That device of having something external take on the weight of your burden and sins is something that we've seen in so many TV shows. I mean, in Always Sunny, Rickety Cricket is the Dorian Gray of the gang. It has just become one of those devices that you see all the time. And by way of appreciation, I think that the original text should be read. But is it spooky? Is it worthy of being part of Spooky Spooktober Stories series? Yes, I think so. Because it explores the dark heart of man in a really interesting way. Usually when you see like a villain or an anti-hero, they are motivated by power. Here you have somebody who's motivated by delicacy and beauty, and who will do anything to preserve it. It is the story of a man who will rip his soul out and sacrifice his humanity on the altar of beauty. And I mean, really, tell me that that's not more true now than it was even back then, with our, really vapid, superficial influencer culture, reality TV, etc. Tell me that you don't know people who would do the exact same thing as Dorian. So overall, great book. I mean, yeah, it's Oscar Wilde. He's fantastic. He's a joy to read. He's great. And his other stuff is amazing too. When I was younger, we got to see Salome live on stage. It's the one with the Dance of Seven Veils and the John the Baptist. And that scared me when I was a kid. I may have been too young to see that. So now it's time to figure out just how sticky this book is. And, it's Oscar Wilde, so I'm expecting this book to be pretty sticky. I used purple for the purple prose. But this book comes in at 132 pages. There were 28 stickies, giving this book a stickiness rating of 4.7. Pretty sticky. I wouldn't have expected anything else from Oscar Wilde. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to this first episode of Spooky Spooktober Stories. Really looking forward to the rest of the books that we have lined up. I tried to choose ones that are a little bit more obscure. I mean, I say that after reading one of the most famous books of all time. I tried to avoid just like the Dracula, Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and go for some ones that may have been forgotten or flew under the radar. This is the most famous one by far of everything that we'll be talking about. So for the horror hipsters out there, hopefully one of the other ones rustles your jimmies or something. I don't even know what that means. Anyway, thank you so much again for tuning in, and I hope you have a great day or some restful slumber and wake up feeling rejuvenated tomorrow. All right, take care. Bye.